Welcome to the Candice Malcolm Show. My name is Kris Sims. I'm the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Thank you so much for making us a part of your day. If you haven't done so yet, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, share it with your friends who need to know. We've got an amazing show for you. We have a prize fighter constitutional lawyer coming up in a moment. Joanna Baron, she's the Executive Director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. For folks who don't know what that group is, they were one of the key groups who had that huge win at the federal court level, where the justice there declared that it was unconstitutional for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to invoke the Emergencies Act. Remember back when people had their bank accounts frozen? That was not a good time. So Joanna Baron is one of the prize fighters at the CCF. We're going to be speaking with her about the notwithstanding clause and why it really matters, including to folks here in Alberta and across the rest of the country. We're going to do that in a second. But first, there's a few things that are on the front burner right now that I had to flag, especially for viewers of this show. So we know folks who are logging on to Juno News. We know folks who appreciate independent news. They like keeping up on top of these issues. So a few things are happening. One, we're seeing a lot of jobs being lost in the energy sector. So there were some bad headlines going around the last few days. People leaving offices with boxes in their hands in Calgary. That's always a terrible thing to see. Okay. So we're having some trouble in the energy sector. And we know that the global energy issue is a big, complicated thing. Okay. It's a huge machine. But it sure doesn't help here in Canada when we still have Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law. We have the energy cap on Alberta energy. It's a production cap. Ottawa will try to say, oh, it's an emissions cap, but the way they've structured it is impossible. So it's a production cap. That is something that the Parliamentary Budget Officer has said will blow billions and billions of dollars out of our economy. Just that one production cap. We still have the tanker ban off of the West Coast. We still have all of these massive problems, okay, where Ottawa is choking Alberta. We're hearing a lot of language and a lot of stuff and words coming out of Ottawa, but I haven't seen any of these laws get repealed. So if we are choking off the energy sector in Alberta, and this is really key here, if international investors, if super smart rich people that run these big companies, okay, things like oil and gas companies, right? If they're looking around for a place to park their money and all they see are a bunch of red lights and no, 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 and stop, stop, stop coming from Canada, they have a lot of other places to invest their money. And the government in Ottawa has created this climate of no happening here across Canada. And guess what? If we don't have full pipeline capacity, if we are not using our natural resources to the best of our ability, we all suffer. Taxpayers suffer. There was an estimate that blew my mind a little while ago. It said since 2015, so since Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was elected and this current government came into power, we've lost out on more than $600 billion. $600 billion. Because we aren't actually using our natural resources, because we keep getting a whole bunch of no coming from Ottawa. So something's got to give, okay? I'm sensing some trouble in the temple here in Alberta. And the reason why I say that is if we're having major problems here, if our jobs numbers aren't looking good, if we're seeing a lot of trouble in the energy industry, if we're seeing companies pulling their money out of this area, that cascades across the rest of Canada. Because Alberta is the economic engine of Canada. And we all don't want to suffer because Alberta is suffering. So something's got to change here. So Carney, unfortunately, Mark Carney, the current Prime Minister, he's spending a lot of time in Europe. Okay? I'm going to pull up a clip here really quick in a second here. But it's from the same globalist meeting they were having on stage where he was chit-chatting with the President of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer. Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer. And that's where he praised the carbon tax, saying it was a textbook good policy. But opposition leader Pierre Poilievre pulled up a different clip, And I wanted to play it here for you for a very specific reason. Okay. Again, to outline, we've got a huge problem with energy companies getting chilly here in Canada and getting worried that they won't actually be able to get their product to market. We've got a huge problem where we're not using our natural resources properly, which is a huge cost to taxpayers, as we've described. We've got a big issue with our enormous trading partner right to our south in a direct trade fight now. Like, gloves are off. You probably see what happened to the film industry announcement the other day. Like, things aren't good, okay? We have Ottawa, which seems to not be doing too much to try to actually get a new trade deal signed with the White House. They seem to be more interested in scoring cheap partisan points on mainstream government-funded TV, which is completely pointless. And all it's doing is hurting normal working people on both sides of the border. So we have all of these massive issues going on here at home in Canada, something that Prime Minister Mark Carney, with all of his brains, needs to apply himself to. But here he is in Europe, and they basically asked him, how are things going in Canada? What things have changed? Listen to this.
Our election and our policy was first and foremost, it was fight the tariffs, have a reaction. We had one of the strongest reactions. Protect our workers. So there were many ways we were doing that, but one of the things is we were taking all of the tariff revenue, putting it back into workers, helping workers retain their jobs, but also retrain, protect our communities against crime. But the core, the core message was build. And it was to build in a positive way. You need.
So there we go. He just keeps going on and on like this. Like, he goes on for about 3 minutes. And I think the term word salad is overused a little bit, but he just keeps talking. It's like somebody turned on the microphone and he just had to keep filling space because he doesn't actually say anything substantive. It takes him a few more questions into this onstage session to even say, kind of accidentally, oh yeah, carbon taxes were a textbook good policy. This is the issue. We've got a serious problem here in Canada. We have about a dozen really serious problems. A lot of them are economic in nature, and they're really hurting taxpayers. So Prime Minister Mark Carney needs to really dig in and focus and fix all these things. He can't just keep on saying nice words to placate the premiers, okay? Because really, time's up. When we start seeing moves, that's what's happening in Calgary right now with that many people losing their jobs and people getting shaky about it. Time's up. They have got to scrap Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law. They've got to get rid of the tanker ban. They've got to get rid of the energy cap. They have got to scrap every single iota of a plan for an industrial carbon tax. You might have seen that we just handed like tons of taxpayers' money to a steel company here in Canada. That's not going to help. That's just a Band-Aid solution. One of the main reasons that steel companies are packing up and leaving and losing money here in Canada is because A, we already have an industrial carbon tax, and B, they know that Carney is going to hammer them with a huge new hidden industrial carbon tax. It's going to be ready anytime now. So the answer isn't choking off all of our industries and choking off all of our natural resources sectors and then throwing taxpayers' money on it that we don't have because we're $1.2 trillion in debt. That is not the answer. The answer is to get government out of the way and to make this machine run smoothly. I also wanted to point out something really quick here in Alberta because, again, something that happens in Alberta spreads across the rest of Canada. The teachers who work in the government-funded schools here in Alberta have decided to go on strike. It was like a 90% strike vote last night. So this means that very soon, thousands of students, I think it's something crazy, like 800,000 students here in Alberta, are going to be locked out of school. I will point out that a lot of these students who are in school right now were also locked out of school a few years ago for a long time, and it took a big toll on them. So this should have been avoided as much as humanly possible. What's frustrating here is that the government of Alberta was offering these teachers a pay raise. They were offering them 12% over the next 4 years. So that's 3% per year. And they were also offering them to move up a grid or consolidate their pay grid. The answer was they would get even more money, the vast majority of them. They were also promising to hire 3,000 new teachers, plus 1,500 new classroom assistants. So that was a pretty big offer. And even the CBC was reporting that if they had accepted this contract, that teachers in Alberta would be the highest paid teachers in all of Western Canada after taxes. And I include that because we're way more affordable, comparatively speaking, here in Alberta than it is in British Columbia. Thank you very much. So Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, she's got a lot on her plate, but she has got to bring an end to this teacher strike as quickly as possible. And here's an idea for her. Back in 2014, the government of British Columbia did something really smart. They took the money that would have been paid to striking teachers, so they were off the job, so they weren't getting that money. Take that money, give it to parents, distribute it all amongst Alberta parents. Here you go, guys. Because now thousands of parents are left in the lurch. Thousands of parents are scrambling to find childcare. Thousands of parents are wondering what to do with their kids during the day while they have to go to work. So Alberta Premier Danielle Smith should take a page out of British Columbia's recent history book, hand that money that was otherwise going to be paid to the striking teachers, and give it to Alberta parents. So lots to do here in Alberta. Now, before we get to what is now being described as a potential constitutional crisis, let's hear from our sponsor.
A quick word from our sponsors, Macamee College. So are you tired of politicians growing government while your freedoms shrink? Then don't just complain. Take the lead. Our partners today, Macamee College, and their applied politics and public affairs program is for freedom-minded Canadians who want to hold the government accountable. In just 2 years, through online evening courses, you'll get the applied skills to run campaigns, organize grassroots movements, and shape policy. You'll get hands-on training in your community and with the party of your choice, so you graduate ready for real change. Now, maybe it's you, maybe it's someone you know, maybe it's your son or daughter, maybe it's your friend who's passionate about politics. Here is a chance to fast-track your career into making an impact. Plus, anyone who subscribes through our link and they are successful in enrolling in this course gets a $500 Juno News scholarship towards your education, because we need more small government leaders standing up for freedom, standing against big government overreach. Intakes are in September and January. Don't wait. It's time to lead. Use the link in the description today. Check it out over at candicemalcolm.com/Macamee. That's MAKAMI.
So we have a lot on our plate, both provincially and federally. But there's something that's taking a lot of lawyers by surprise. And it really matters because it could affect our ability across different provinces to be able to stand up to courts. And in particular, in Alberta's case, you know how Alberta takes the government to court to get them to rule on things like carbon taxes and pipelines and uses of natural resources and all of those important things. And we get rulings this way and that, and we get Ottawa to listen and sometimes not. If suddenly the courts are the ones that have the final say, despite the notwithstanding clause, that could be a really big deal. How big of a deal? Let's find out. Joining me now is Joanna Baron. She's the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. And bear with me for a second, Joanna. I always introduce folks from your team this way. They're one of the key groups that got that win at the federal court level that ruled that it was wrong for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to invoke the Emergencies Act. Folks might remember the huge trucker protest, the Freedom Convoy, all that stuff. It was her team and a few other people that went to the mat and got that win at the federal court level. That was a huge win. And so, sorry, Joanna, that's how I introduced Christine Van Geyn, like before her name. So,
and hopefully to be upheld by the Federal Court of Appeal soon. We'll hear that decision at any day, and we will go all the way to the Supreme Court no matter what.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're a super busy lady, but you had a great piece in The Hub, and we're going to pull up a screenshot of it here. And it's where you do a really good explainer of the notwithstanding clause. Now, this is making a lot of news in relation to Quebec with some of its, I believe it's their religious symbols issue. But you described it as a safety valve. the notwithstanding clause as a safety valve. Can you just explain to our audience exactly what the notwithstanding clause is, how long have we had it for, and what is its purpose?
Yeah, so the notwithstanding clause was the deliberate democratic compromise arrived at in the original negotiations leading up to the adoption of the charter in 1982. And we know in particular the Prairie premiers, namely Alan Blakely and Peter Lougheed, would not have agreed to the adoption of the charter without Section 33. Now, what does Section 33 do? It allows legislatures to adopt legislation notwithstanding the charter. That doesn't purely mean that they're overriding rights. It means that they're signaling we have a different interpretation about the requirements of charter rights than we think judges are going to have. We have different legislative priorities. And so it allows us to wield that judgment and sort of it effectuates this very careful balance between the power of judges and legislatures, which everybody understood the charter was going to give much more judges to power to judges. Judges are unelected. They are not accountable to constituencies. They're not connected to the realities of governing. There's no question that governments overreach all the time. We see that as well. And so the notwithstanding clause has important limitations. It has to be renewed every 5 years. It has to be publicly pronounced. And so the public has the opportunity to vote governments out if they don't like what they've done with the notwithstanding clause. So it's certainly not a get out of jail free card.
Excellent description. So, if I may, so on the political side of things and the elected government, right, we have the ability, obviously, to vote for our members of parliament federally. So, we're able to hold those individuals to account that way. Here in the province of Alberta, we can vote for our members of the legislative assembly, and we also have recall legislation here in Alberta. So, it kind of warms my heart that it was Prairie premiers that were insisting on having this form of a safety valve. And then is it fair to describe this as a balancing mechanism between the courts and the commons?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a recognition that Canada has a Westminster style parliamentary democracy. And in Westminster style parliamentary democracies, Parliament is supreme. Parliament decides on the contour and shapes of rights. And so Canada kind of came into more of a hybrid system with this defined Bill of Rights. But Section 33 was really, a release valve, as you mentioned at the beginning, to recognize that there are some times when there's going to be disagreements between judges and courts, and will give this override mechanism again that is limited and needs to be, held in check by the public. It
Now,
acknowledges just that judges can get it wrong, right?
sure, they're human. They can get it wrong. They have takes on things, and sometimes they can get it wrong. And I find this distinction really interesting because in the United States, in different various areas, there's more of an elected feel to it, right? So judges in some jurisdictions can be elected by the people. They have to stand for election again. They're much more, it's more of a transactional or direct contact, I find, than it is up here in Canada. So why then is this making more news? I've noticed, especially in the Eastern based media, that this is popping up a lot, particularly in regards to Quebec. What is the current federal government trying to do when it comes to the notwithstanding clause?
So I would say that this is, to me, the biggest shock so far of the Mark Carney government in general. He's tried to govern quite from the center and with a steady hand. The federal government filed its factum last week in this big Quebec case about religious symbols, but it's also more fundamentally about how does Section 33 work? Once a government invokes Section 33, can judges still decide whether the law itself was constitutional or unconstitutional? That's called issuing a moot declaration. The Carney government filed a factum that really shocked the legal community by asking the Supreme Court to give expanded powers to the courts once a government invokes Section 33, not just whether the formal requirements were met, but basically whether the government crossed the line, caused what they call irreparable damage, or invoked it for too long of a period, essentially for the courts to be the final arbiters of whether Section 33 was properly invoked, when in fact, anybody who understands the history of charter negotiations knows that the whole purpose of Section 33 was to give the legislature a free hand, as it were, and take something out of the purview of courts.
So then, going along that line of thinking, say that this happened. Could you paint us a picture of a scenario that could take place in that situation? Like,
Yeah. So let's say a government, it could be a provincial government, it could be the federal government. So, for example, one high profile example was Doug Ford invoked the notwithstanding clause about 5 years ago in a proposal to dramatically reduce the number of wards in Toronto City. This was part of a view that Toronto City Council was overstaffed, bogged down in bureaucratic nonsense. And he invoked the notwithstanding clause. Now, it turned out the court said that he could do it anyways. It wasn't unconstitutional, but he was saying, this is a legislative priority. It was part of my mandate. And with this new proposed framework that the federal government is suggesting, the courts could say, we think that this is an inappropriate move. We think that this could cause, irreparable harm. This couldn't be unwound. So we're going to override this and say that you can't do it. So it basically gives judges the veto.
now, sorry to ask a amateur question. Is there an extra, like I'm picturing like the piling up of hands of kids when they're trying to compete. Is there an extra hand then that Ford could have done in that situation? Or if the court, say in this imagined scenario, say this goes through in the future, what would happen then if the court says, yeah, you can't do this? Does that just mean the wards would have stayed the same number and tough cookies?
Well, this is why you may have heard this phrase a lot over the last week or 10 days or so, constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
You could create a constitutional crisis. Because, yeah, what if then you just have a game of chicken where Doug Ford says, no, I disagree. I'm not doing this. And the court says, you have to do this. We have the final say. Does Doug Ford go ahead with something that is technically under the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court of Canada unconstitutional, or does he give in? That's where the constitutional crisis is going to come up. And we've already heard, I was looking last night at the intervener factums, Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, they are vehemently opposed to this proposal on the part of the federal government. So it actually is a threat to national unity. Because as you know, there are some tensions between the provinces and the feds right now, and the feds are really doing a power grab here.
Yeah. Like, this is my first take on this is, wow, this isn't helping. Like,
No,
this is making it worse.
real, real.
Right? Exactly. Read the room. If I can keep you for a couple of more minutes, I just kind of want to go along this same line of thinking. I'm going to try to put this nicely. The average working person has got a lot of questions right now when it comes to judges. So there are some sentencing rulings that are coming out at like the lower court level where they're like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't pass the smell test. I don't agree with this. And so I'm concerned here that this could further distance the common person, as in our representatives in the House of Commons, from the judiciary, from the judges. Like, it seems that they clearly are not really reading the room here. Are you concerned that this could cause a further disconnect and a level of distrust between the people, our big population, and the small group of people who happen to be judges in this country?
Well, yeah, exactly. I'm definitely concerned about it because part of Section 33's great wisdom is that it allowed room for legislative disagreement with judicial rulings, for the legislature to say, we've heard your opinion and we're going to do this, and we carry the consequences. If the people want to vote us out in 5 years because they disagree, then we'll wear this. But you're a judge, you're cloistered, you went to law school, you're very smart, but you're not necessarily in touch with the realities of governing. And so it's like there's, different types of wisdom, and the great, strength of Section 33, it is allows for those multiple inputs. The last thing I'll say that's been brought up a lot is that giving judges even more power, as this would propose to do, will just further politicize the judiciary. We've seen how this has happened in the United States, where everybody understands that Supreme Court judges have a partisan vote, and so nobody really looks at them anymore as neutral arbiters. Everybody understands that one of the big games of bringing in a Republican or Democratic president is hopefully they get to stack some Supreme Court judges. For the most part, our judiciary has avoided that kind of rank partisanship. But the more that we give judges a final veto power over fundamental questions like euthanasia, sex work, safe injection sites, all of these fundamental issues of modern life. Now, the trans and preferred pronouns issue is coming up, and maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. These things, courts can weigh in on, but now, if the court were to accept, the Supreme Court were to accept the federal government's proposal, they would have the final say.
I wanted to pick up on that because I think that is something that Premier Danielle Smith has indicated that she would be willing to use the notwithstanding clause about, correct?
Yes. So I think it was about 2 weeks ago, Premier Smith proposed using the notwithstanding clause to shield upcoming legislation on gender identity in schools from charter challenges. So the legislation would ban children under 15 from changing their name or pronouns at school without parental consent. It would also restrict hormone therapy for trans youth under a certain age. And again, there have been a number of controversial and varying decisions popping up across the country about these various policies and their constitutionality. Clearly, it is something where there is gray area, we can say at the very least. And it would be hubristic to assume that judges are some philosopher king that can give not just the right answer, but the right answer for every part of this vast and very diverse country.
I find, having moved to Alberta, that their ability to have direct democracy, to have referendums, to have recall legislation, even at the school board level, at the city level, it really kind of opens up free speech. It does. It really kind of opens up accountability. I've just noticed it that politicians, even in the Edmonton legislature, they're way quicker to respond. And I can't help but think that one of the reasons for that is because we have these mechanisms, we have these checks and balances. And if we're electing people to the legislature in Edmonton to speak for us and represent us, and they wind up hitting loggerheads with courts, you can see why a mechanism like the notwithstanding clause would be so important. I wanted to, is there anything else I haven't asked you that you think is critical at this stage for people to understand? Oh, yes. Why now? Why is the federal government doing this now? Like, do we know?
That's the $1 million question. We
Okay.
don't know. I can tell you some of the rampant speculation I've heard. One speculation I heard is that Ottawa is setting up a showdown between itself and Alberta, actually, and is going to set itself as the sort of protector of rights and Alberta as the villain. That's one theory. Another theory that I've heard is that this was basically a lawyer's brainchild. It could have been David Lametti, who was dean of McGill Law, very academic lawyer, obviously recently left PMO. This was just a hobby horse of his. There's no question that lawyers like to bring in tests and frameworks. So this was really just a lawyer's idea, and the federal government ran with it. It could be also that Carney is looking to wedge himself with Pierre Poilievre, who has said very openly that if he were to be prime minister, he would invoke the notwithstanding clause on the federal level for the very first time in relation to mandatory minimum sentences and violent criminals getting out on bail easily. But nobody knows for sure, Kris.
So, lastly, on this issue with Alberta, could this then be used, say, apart from the social issues as they're often described, say that we wanted to strike down C-69, or say we wanted to get rid of the energy cap, or strike down the tanker ban off the West Coast, and say that the federal government said, okay, fine, and agreed with us, there would be a miracle, and
Yeah.
we would be able to actually get our energy out to market. In this situation, say the Supreme Court or a level of court says, you know what, I don't think so, because for whatever reason, name it, national unity or environmental, blah, blah, blah. And in that situation, the prime minister or the government in Ottawa says, notwithstanding your decision and opinion on this, we're going ahead with it anyway. In this scenario, if this goes through, then would the Supreme Court have the final say and be able to just squash it?
Yeah, absolutely. The clear implication is that Ottawa is proposing a transfer of power. The federal government is proposing a transfer of power to the courts to have the ultimate reviewing say. It says, particularly if the courts find that an invocation of the notwithstanding clause would cause what they call irreparable harm, which you could easily see in the context, or you could easily see a lawyer making this argument in the context you bring up about energy pipelines and arguments around environmental impact. They would have the final ignored. And again, that's where the constitutional crisis would come in, because it would come down to basically a battle of wills. Would Alberta just plow ahead with it, even though it's officially unconstitutional? Or at that point, do you just have to say, we have to play by the rules? This is why this is so poorly thought out.
Wow. Okay. Where do we go from here? What's the next thing that you're waiting for on this issue?
Well, we've been reviewing. There are 60 interveners in this upcoming appeal at the Supreme Court of Canada. The Canadian Constitution Foundation is one of them. We have been clear that we do not support this great expansion of the judicial role. And the hearing will be, I imagine, at some point this winter, and we'll see what the Supreme Court says. It would be very radical for the Supreme Court to go along with this, but I can tell you, having reviewed some of the 60 factums, that a majority of the interveners are asking for courts to have an enhanced role in supervising the invocation of the notwithstanding clause. The majority of the provinces are opposed to it, and they tend to have a bit more weight, right? The court understands that they're more important than niche interest groups like the association for criminal lawyers, and there's a million of these groups, so the provinces will be heard and their concerns will be taken very, very seriously. But nobody knows what this current Supreme Court will do, unfortunately.
Is it still open for interveners, for people to declare themselves to be interveners? It's closed. Okay.
No.
Okay. I just wanted to see if there's a chance to put more hands on deck in that situation. Okay. Briefly, I know that I think you guys are doing more of a deep dive analysis on this because, of course, it's important to do your homework. But I'm seeing some concerning posts coming from members of parliament, and I think they're earnestly concerned about this. They're saying effectively that some of the free speech or free expression issues that we were dealing with a few years ago, I think it's online harms or trying to limit what people can see and say online, that it's coming back to the House of Commons. I saw a post from a member of parliament who was highlighting elements of this, saying that this could prevent you from expressing yourself in Canada. Where are we with that? Are you guys taking a look at that?
So we had actually hoped that the Carney government would walk it back entirely, and it looked like at the end of the last parliamentary session that huge swaths of that bill were completely dead. Certainly the parts that did things like give possible life sentences for future pre-crime. But we did see the announcement last week that Stephen Guilbeault, who it seems incredible to me, has preserved his place in government, would like to bring back a version of this bill. So we're watching that very carefully.
Okay. I'm glad you're watching that very carefully. And based on our experience with Stephen Guilbeault with pipelines and carbon taxes, in that little thing they tried slipping through in that study where they were thinking about imposing a truck tax and they dared say that we were peddling disinformation. Yeah, that guy's an ideological zealot. And we have to keep a very close eye on him. The idea that he could be in charge of free speech laws, free expression laws, like as a tax fighter, that makes me very nervous. Joanna Baron, where can we find your work? Where can people support the Canadian Constitution Foundation?
So we're at theccf.ca. We have free courses. You'll find all of our news releases. You can sign up for our weekly Freedom Update. We also co-host, along with my colleagues Josh and Christine, a weekly podcast called Not Reserving Judgment, where you can get in 30 to 45 minutes all of the constitutional analysis from a liberty-focused perspective that you need.
Do you still do your hot takes? I haven't listened in a little bit.
We do our bad legal takes of the week where we sometimes it's politicians, often it's law professors, but there's always some people across Canada that are just having some horrible bad legal takes. So we
It's
will
legit
highlight.
funny. Like I've laughed out loud walking my dog listening to those bad legal takes. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Once again, that was the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Joanna Baron. Be sure to go check out their website. And for real, Not Reserving Judgment is a really good podcast to listen to. Like, I feel smarter after listening to it. And they often discuss topics like we were just discussing. And also, I would say kind of lower court cases that may not have made national news because they're all lawyers and they all have nerdy lawyer friends. And so they all talk amongst themselves and then they produce a really good show. In a serious note, it's really important to pay attention to groups like the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Like I said off the top, they were one of the key groups that fought for and won at the federal court level, which described and decided that what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, when he invoked the Emergencies Act, did was wrong, that it was unconstitutional, that you can't do that to people, you can't freeze their bank accounts, and you shouldn't have invoked the Emergencies Act. That's under appeal right now, but I'll put it this way. If you are too afraid to speak truth to power, as the kids say, if you are too afraid to express yourself and express your displeasure with the government, no matter what it's doing, earnestly, if you're from the left or the right, you should be able to freely express yourself in Canada and say that I want to hold the government to account. If you're suddenly not allowed to do that, then we're in really deep trouble. So, folks, make sure you head on over to Juno News. Make sure you subscribe to Juno News, because we're the ones that do these in-depth, deep dive interviews with important groups like the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and share this interview with people who need to know.